Hello and welcome to Virtually 2023, Nomensa's free virtual web accessibility and digital inclusion conference. It's great to be back. In the next 3 days, we'll see 9 sessions from some of the leading thinkers in accessibility and inclusive design share knowledge, best practice, and the latest thinking in this field. It's great to see signups from all around the world. We hope everyone who joins us finds the conference valuable and takes lots of knowledge back into their day-to-day roles. We're joined this week by MyClearText, who are providing live captions. You can access these by clicking on the closed caption button at the bottom of Zoom. Or alternatively, we've provided a stream text link in the chat for a fully adjustable page of captions. All the sessions this week will be recorded and they're going to be available online shortly after the conference ends on Global Accessibility Awareness Day this Thursday. Today, we've got 3 fantastic sessions lined up. A little later today at 1 p.m. UK time, we have Bianca Prins, Global Head of Accessibility at ING Bank, discussing the upcoming European Accessibility Act. And shortly after that, at 3 p.m, we have Clint Tham of Coursera, who will be talking all about how you can craft accessible experiences through structured content. First up, though, we have Nomensa's co-founder and director of accessibility and co-editor of WCAG, Alastair Campbell, with his talk, Lessons from Training. In this talk, Alastair will reflect on over 15 years running accessibility training and examine the gaps in knowledge that people have arrived with over the years. Please do get involved in the discussion in the chat. Make sure your chat settings are switched to panelists and attendees so everyone can see your messages. And if you've got any questions for Alastair, please do submit them using the Q&A box. I'll try and get through as many as I can with him at the end. So yeah, without further ado, I will hand over to Alastair to kick things off.
Thanks very much. And that enables me to skip my intro slide. I'll get stuck straight into it. So this is slightly meta in that I'm talking about accessibility training and what I have learned about organizations who come on this training. There's a bit at the beginning about the sort of educational roots and why training is unfortunately so important still. What kind of gaps people have when they attend the training, and what should people in organizations try and do those gaps. So I'll give a little context first. So what is the kind of training people have been doing? The most common one I do is a general course. I call it product team training. We've had a lot of organizations go through this from the public sector, commercial sector, charities, and it's a one-day course aimed at kind of getting everyone from designers, developers, testers, product owners, everyone sort of involved in creating digital products up to a reasonable level of accessibility knowledge in one day. It's quite practical. There are exercises kind of covering the guidelines and general requirements, and you should learn to do kind of basic accessibility checks and know what good looks like from an accessibility point of view. There's also more of a kind of workshop-y type session towards the end where we go through the team's structure and process. So the team learns about the accessibility requirements, and then we work through how to apply them in kind of their scenario with their tools, resources, and process. So apologies, this is slightly meta. So that's the agenda slide for the training with the intro. How do people with disabilities use digital products, integrating with your process, and we do Q&A as we go through. It never lasts till the end. So that's kind of what I'm basing on is 10 years of this. We do other training like mobile and PDF and other things, but this is the kind of the main general training. And the first question I ask, either as part of the intros or shortly afterwards, is who has actually done any kind of accessibility training before? I've got an image on screen with a dozen people and there's one hand sticking up, and that's pretty typical. It's about 1 in 10 people will sort of say they have done any previous accessibility training. Maybe 3 to 5 people if it's a public sector or a place with sort of particular accessibility requirements. And it's possible some people don't admit to previous training if it was a while ago. But generally the level of confidence is pretty low. And I made this point in Twitter thread a while ago that included Gerald Spool. He's a well-known UX person. And apparently the UX training center that he runs does include accessibility by default. And to me, that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. That's great. However, until it's built into the default route for designers and developers, like university courses and boot camps and things like that, it's still going to be the biggest problem for creating accessible products. And there does tend to be a bit of overconfidence sometimes in usually more senior sort of people. So my colleague Ronnie has started getting stats on this and has asked participants to rate their level of knowledge before they went through training. And in a recent case, the product owner thought the team had a really good level of knowledge, but the results kind of indicated otherwise. There were 2 people who put the middle option of a fair amount of knowledge, 5 said a little bit, and 7 said almost nothing. This is quite typical. So if you're in a senior position, you kind of have to default to assuming that teams do not have much knowledge of accessibility unless shown otherwise. And I'm just at the moment talking about, what's getting up to the sort of a base level of accessibility. It does have to be a continuous learning process. If you know everything about accessibility working with one team and then you move organization and you're working on a different kind of interface in a different area with different sort of requirements and user journeys, there are probably new things you'll need to learn from an accessibility point of view. So you have to keep applying accessibility principles, and whenever you're doing something different, learning how accessibility is impacted from that. I've got a picture of people stretching on screen, and I consider applying accessibility as a bit like stretching in relation to exercise. If you were very good at running and stretching after running, and say you started cycling instead of running, you don't just skip stretching because it's a different exercise. You might do different stretches, but you do need to stretch. I'm discovering as you get older. So it's something that sort of should be an integral part of both your sort of working process and how you sort of apply to new things. And then sometimes, when I started off doing the training over 10 years ago, I used to do a very quick introduction and get stuck into the practical exercises as quickly as possible. Then sometimes, usually during the contrast or structure kind of sections, someone would start squirming. Back in the days when we primarily did things offline, training offline. So when they saw something difficult to do for their situation, they would start looking for an out. So it might be to do with numbers, like, but how many people does this affect really? Or it might be a legal argument. So in introduction to the training, I've started preempting that, which has been quite effective. So you might start with the headline stats, and that usually prevents arguments about whether such a requirement affects a certain amount of people. And you can customize that message for different organizations. So quite a lot of organizations, we've worked with e-commerce places where their audience skewed older, or public sector where people with disabilities, it might be 100% of people with disabilities will actually be using their service. So it's usually fairly easy to come up with scenarios that affect an organization, so that they can see, okay, yep, these people are likely to come and use this. And even if there aren't, there are often scenarios such as present buying or digital chores that you can sort of incorporate. So, for example, somebody who's blind might not buy a skateboard, but their nephew might want a skateboard and they need to understand what they look like in order to buy the right one. And digital chores where somebody with a disability might not be working, their partner goes out to work, and then they have to get the house insurance or even car insurance and things like that you might not have expected. And it helps sometimes actually to lead on to the legal argument, because it only really takes one person to complain, and then you get into the legal sphere. And again, how you talk about that, or what what impact it's going to have will depend on the organisation. So in the UK, we've got clear requirements for public sector. We've got the public sector regulations, accessibility regulations. We have less clear requirements under the Equalities Act, but they are applicable. It basically says any product or service should not discriminate. And if you're working with an organisation, or an organisation that works internationally, there are various different laws. The US and Canada are quite litigious, and interestingly, there are some new EU laws that will apply to travel and e-commerce sites. I know those in particular, it is a bit wider than that. And I think Bianca will be talking about that in a later session today. So if you do business in the EU, that is going to be important from a legal point of view. So usually those are pretty strong sort of numbers and legal arguments. And I try and get those out of the way quickly, because what I will come back to is that accessibility is part of doing a professional job. It's something that should be considered like performance and security. It's part of a professional job in creating a robust digital product. So that's the sort of overall. I don't want people to think that I get stuck on the numbers and the legals. I try and get those out the way, primarily so that it doesn't come up later when we're doing the interesting stuff. So then in the training, a common question is, what does good accessibility look like? Which, for something where you're trying to remove the barriers, can be very hard to see. Some aspects are obvious. You might have very dense information, you might have poor contrast. Those are the things you might be able to notice quite easily. But many aspects are invisible if you don't have a disability. So the question really kind of transforms into, how do I test for accessibility? I categorize the guidelines into kind of 4 areas. And the first of this is keyboard accessibility. And this is the exercise I start with. It's basically get people to use their own product without using a mouse. Slightly different on if it's a mobile app team, but on the web, this is very straightforward. And even people who consciously know that keyboard accessibility is important have often never tried it themselves. It's easy to do. It can be explained on one slide. The tab button picture I have here is where you start. And it's often what I use as kind of a sniff test of a site's or product's accessibility is if they've thought about the keyboard accessibility, they have probably thought about accessibility. Whereas if they haven't, then it's likely there are lots of other issues, not just keyboard accessibility. And it's just a really useful exercise that is an obvious gap that's easily filled. And then once you've got through just that basics and people's eyes start opening, it's a really good practical exercise to then drill into where those issues have come from. And on screen, I've got a little screen capture from Jet 2, which is kind of my go-to bad example for keyboard accessibility. And what you might notice is in the main navigation, there's about 7 options, 3 of which are just skipped over if you're tabbing through. And then actually the entire form in terms of trying to book a fare, trying to book a flight, is invisible from a keyboard focus point of view. So it's not a good example, but it's not actually that unusual either. So if I'm sitting down with the team and we've just done that exercise, I've got them to shout out the kind of issues they've run into. And when it's the team who, work on this product, you really can start drilling into things. So, which team or people are responsible for the menu. Not that we're trying to throw blame, but just they know what the how it's put together. So, what front-end framework might be used, what's the intended functionality from a mouse point of view, how do we translate that into keyboard, why do some menu items work differently from others? And once you start drilling into things, it helps you to get to know how it was designed. So I can start sort of bridging that gap in between their process and the accessibility requirements. And often for keyboard issues, the developers might be aware of the problems in a fairly abstract sense, but they're not sure what to do when presented with a kind of mouse-orientated design. So sometimes it's as easy as adding a tab index attribute, but often the design needs some careful thought, and you start working into what patterns to use. So these little practical exercises, you don't just kind of stop and go, oh yeah, that's terrible. It's why is this thing the way it is? So that's really helpful when you're talking to product teams. This kind of the section on keyboard also goes through switch and voice output, switch access and voice input. The key thing is non-mouse usage, and you can find most things just with that kind of simple check, just going through with the keyboard. And then when tackling low vision requirements, one of the assumptions, one of the gaps that's often missed is the landscape aspect. So most sites are responsive these days, which is a good thing, particularly from a low vision point of view. However, when people are putting together a site, they might make assumptions around the amount of verticals sort of screen state that you have when you don't have very much width. And these things can be quite different in accessibility. So I've got a screen capture of msn.com, and when you zoom in, the fixed header takes up 80–90% of the content. And that's quite a different assumption from, I've also got a screenshot from the mobile version of that. They do seem to be sort of presenting a slightly different version on mobile. But in principle, you could have the same sort of header, which is sticky, and it would work perfectly fine on a mobile device because it's in portrait. Whereas if you're a low vision user on a regular sort of desktop or laptop screen and you zoom in, it is landscape, and you have a lot less vertical height to play with. So it might work on mobile, but not zoomed desktop. So you have to know to check. There are solutions for this, like vertical media queries will allow you to check how much height you've got and unstick the header, but you have to know to check. And that's something that people generally haven't done as part of their process. And then another aspect for low vision is contrast. And actually, I tend to find these days most people know about text contrast. They might not know the details of what ratio is required, but they know you're supposed to check, the contrast of text on the background. And it seems natural to include icons with that. That's not a big bridge when I go through the training. But I've lost count of the times that people are already testing text and icons, but not things like inputs. I'm not sure why. The guidelines have been around since 2018, but I don't think people generally think to apply it to things like the border on an input field. This is quite key. If you're low vision, you might be zooming in, struggling to see what's on screen. The example I've got up is a light gray border on each of the inputs. I think it's about 1.5:1 contrast, very low contrast. So not great from that point of view. And again, quite easily tested, but tends to surprise people. The third category of sort of accessibility requirements I go through is based on screen readers. And I used to cover sort of, it seems quite natural to go from keyboard to screen reader usage, and I would put those next to each other. However, after a couple of months after a particular training session, I met with a developer who then proudly showed me that you could tab through every text element on the page. He basically added a tab index of 0 to every item, because in his mind, he was conflating between how a screen reader user works and what keyboard access is needed. So whereas somebody who's looking at a screen and using a switch or using a keyboard or a non-mouse device, they will only want to go to the interactive controls, links and buttons and inputs and things like that. When a screen reader is working, when somebody is using a screen reader, they will go through all of the content, not just the interactive content, but the developer had really conflated these two concepts. So I'm fairly sure on the day that I said not to do this, However, I could kind of see how it's easy for those sections to blur together. So that's why I sort of separate them now. So keyboard, low vision, so you start with something completely different. And then you go on to Screenreader, which is all about the sort of structure and metadata that the page has that is communicating with the screen reader. So there is separation. That's quite important, otherwise you get some odd effects. And with web developers, probably going back 10 years, I used to be fairly safe in assuming some knowledge of basic HTML structure like headings and buttons, and there's over 100 elements of which you probably need to know about 20 or so. But these days, quite a few people are coming through having learned development via a particular framework, which probably abstracts away the actual HTML code. So although their framework might have things called buttons and other elements in it, they may not actually map to what the browser is receiving. And mobile developers as well may not have come across the impact of roles. If the platform doesn't require them, they're sort of applied as attributes or extra things that you can add in the code, but tend not to be as required. So I think in Android, there is a concept of tags, and those can help. But particularly on iOS, I found that you can just have things completely missing, and the developer doesn't know what you mean when you start talking about particular roles like headings. So the thing that most people also don't get about adding structure or roles to a page or view is that they might change it once they realize what they should be. So during the training, I often run through a markup exercise. So people are given essentially a screenshot of one of their pages or views of their app, and they have to start marking up things like I've got on the screen. This is just an example from the App Store, and I've marked up what the actual code is at the moment because it's quite good. So they've got a couple of headings, and then most of the rest are buttons, and they've got a tabs component at the bottom of the page. So when people go through this exercise, they quite often spot inconsistencies in their own designs and change the designs based on what the most appropriate structure should be. Particularly on websites where you might have different templates as you go through different sections, it's really easy to design those in a way where the structure becomes inconsistent. And actually, they go through this process, settle on the structure, and think, oh, actually, yes, that is a better structure. We're going to apply that universally across those templates. It also helps if you're doing this sort of thing in like a collaborative session. So you've got designers, developers, product owner, three amigos in some processes, I think, is this sort of collaborative session. And then you've got this interplay back and forth between the designers who are really focused on the intent and the usability, and the developers who are thinking about how am I going to implement this. And there's quite often a bit of back and forth that will adjust things in the design. It might just be this thing is, it's not a button, it's a tab or something like that. But sometimes it can be things which make little adjustments in the design. And it's much more useful to do this at the design stage than it is later on. So it's a really useful exercise that it takes 5-10 minutes, and it could save a lot of time when you go through the rest of the process. When you're doing this, the designers and developers can need to work together to settle on a reasonable level of granularity. If you've got some good default components, or you're using kind of platform-based components that has standard roles built in, you should be able to use those without adding a lot of detail. Whereas if you're creating something fairly custom, then you need to think about how much detail to go into. You're not trying to dictate to the developers how to develop, but it should be enough to give them the expectations of how it's supposed to work. And in the training, I've just mentioned, we can't rely on developers to know basic structural elements, so we definitely can't assume they know about the accessible rich internet applications specification, which is sort of another level on in the kind of developer and sort of technical levels. I have a picture of an opera singer on the screen. It's not that kind of ARIA. It is very much a specification from the W3C, but it's a nice acronym. And when I go through ARIA, and I say, I tend to leave it to the end of the training and say, if you're not a developer or a tester, you can probably leave now. You're welcome to stay, but this is going to be the very technical bit. And then we focus on the process of how to implement ARIA components rather than going through. We could spend days going through different components, how they're supposed to work, and how to test them. But the really key things is I find that's better done as homework. So we focus on the process, how to find the appropriate pattern for what you're trying to achieve, and then how to test the results, generally with a screen reader. And we can go through some currently accessible examples. So there are plenty around. Apart from the ARIA patterns, you've got things like GDS components. We've got other sort of places where we can test those. But yeah, it's best done as homework. So go away, create, come back and ask questions. It's kind of a practice thing rather than necessarily a training thing. Cognitive and deafness is the sort of non-technical grouping of guidelines that I go through in the training. Things like animation tend to be readily understood. So once you mention people with, say, on the autistic spectrum, really struggle with animation, that seems to click with people. There are solutions for that in terms of preventing those animations. And actually, it's fairly common for there to be one or two people in each training session who may have either some cognitive or vestibular issue. I even once accidentally gave somebody a migraine because without warning, I put up Ling's cars as a slide, which is super animated, chickens walking around and everything. And somebody fairly quickly got a mild migraine from that. So I've always had to give warnings, and that's not coming up now. But yeah, quite often there are people who are affected in the training compared to, we don't tend to get that many sort of screen reader or low vision or people with mobility issues in the training. However, when we're talking about cognitive issues, I would say what tends to help most isn't the guidelines. There's a really strong overlap with usability. So actually usability orientated methods like usability testing, card sorting, interviews, the whole sort of range of UX issues, UX methodologies is the best way to tackle the sort of accessibility of a product from a cognitive point of view. Anything you can do to simplify the interface, reduce the amount of words, reduce jargon is going to help a lot of people. And in fact, including people with cognitive issues in your research, in your usability testing, is going to make that testing much more effective. Quite often with people on the spectrum, you get very honest, or possibly even blunt feedback. And it's easier to tell when somebody is struggling with something, whereas testing with the general population, they might pause for a moment, work it out and move on. Somebody with a cognitive impairment might pause, say what's wrong, and then try and work it out. So I found it's very, very useful to include people with cognitive impairments in your standard usability testing. And another one that sort of falls into that same category as people not necessarily knowing the sort of underlying HTML elements is autocomplete. So this is a method of telling the browser what data is expected from an input. So it can fill it in for the user. So that's helpful. It can also help people who have a browser plugin that applies icons to the page because they really struggle with language. So the browser will look through the code and either based on the content or things like autocomplete, it will add an icon, literally lay it over in the page to assist that person with their understanding. Now, I just find developers generally don't know necessarily that autocomplete even has values apart from off, which is sometimes applied at the form level. So those were a lot of the gaps I've been coming across in terms of when I run through training, what are the gaps that kind of surprise me? And then that leads on to the question of what does good look like from an accessibility point of view as an organization? So if we're looking at all these sort of different gaps, what does that lead us to? And I'm afraid the bad news is, unless you know otherwise, you're probably at square one. The level of accessibility knowledge will be low, and your processes and artifacts don't include accessibility. So how would we know if we were incorporating accessibility? Because actually, it's much easier to know if accessibility has been incorporated in the creation process than it is when you're looking at the final output. So first thing is, accessibility training would be available. It is vital, as we've said, because it's not part of people's default routes into their careers. At least until it's better incorporated into university and boot camps and things like that, training will need to be available to teams and required for new starters. Also, your requirements would include aspects for people with disabilities. So quite often there are sort of aspects for the whole user journey, offline and on, that should be identified. I've got a picture from, it's a YouTube video. If you look up the blind photographer flights, it's from a guy who calls himself the blind photographer because he does a lot of photography. And he did a video for the whole sort of user journey from booking a flight to getting on the plane. So that's very much a sort of online, offline journey where he was booking online, but he had to book the kind of travel assistance. So somebody would meet him at the sort of outside of the airport, help him through to get to, all booked in and onto the flight. So it's should be a very joined up process. And that's fairly rare still these days. And the best place to find this is from user research. But you may also, if you're working in an organization, have an internal department like customer services or sort of an inclusion director or something along those lines, who will already have a good starting point for you. Might not know everything about your particular user journey, but they'll know what people complain about already. And if you have accessibility incorporated into your processes, you will probably have accessibility annotations being there. Most people have probably heard about shift left and design accessibility in, but until you understand the requirements in detail, it doesn't really sink in. And annotations are a good way to make that concrete. There are toolkits for accessibility annotations. I've got an example from Figma on screen, or you can make your own. It's just, an extra layer that you add with some boxes and words in them. Generally, you might need to explore a little bit what kind of level, what granularity of annotations are needed. But once that's part of the process, it's just really helpful to make sure it's incorporated. And what does that get incorporated into? So hopefully you have something like acceptance criteria, or at least a JIRA ticket with the designs in it and some requirements or user stories or things like that. So whatever artifact that is, it needs to include accessibility requirements. We do get some pushback on that. They don't necessarily fit in with people's kind of user story format. You don't want to add 20 new user stories in order to sort of cover all the accessibility bases. But if they're not incorporated in some form, there's probably nothing in the process to make sure that will actually get developed in and tested. If the tester can't see it from that original ticket, it might as well not exist. So we do need that in there in some form. The best way is actually to customize sort of requirements. So you might, if it's an interactive component, you might be talking about keyboard functionality. If it's more of a sort of template and a design, you might it might be sort of more simple around things like headings. But do customize them. If you start copying and pasting from one component to another, it'll just start getting ignored. It's kind of a banner blindness thing. So they do need to be there. Another thing you would notice in an accessibility mature organization is that the overhead of change is understood. So you wouldn't hear, oh, let's tear up our design system and start with a new front-end framework. Because again, you'd be going back to square one from an accessibility point of view. If the current components are accessible, rebranding your sort of current component library would be a much better approach, because you're then, but in contrast to one side, you're generally maintaining the accessibility of those tried and tested components. And that's another thing you could look at, how mature are we from an organizational point of view, from an accessibility point of view. Do you have kind of this virtuous circle? So I've got a diagram on screen. At the bottom, it's got a sort of project lifecycle going from discovery to launch. And the output of that should feed up into things like code libraries, design patterns, brand guidelines. So if you find issues when you do one project, you don't have to re-find those issues in the next project with the different team. You build those into the component libraries, and if you've got accessibility guidance, make a note of it in there so that you're preventing issues in future. So that's why I sort of call it a virtuous circle. These central resources can save a lot of time. When we do testing, we will essentially give public sector clients who use the GDS components and patterns properly a discount, as in it takes us less time to test their stuff. There can still be bugs, but that base level of accessibility is so much higher. We find so many less issues. It's really effective at raising the standards. Also, the systematic use of components means that if we come back with issues and they're solved at the component level and rolled out, the cost of acting on those accessibility results is much cheaper. And an accessibility mature organization would use automated testing, but not rely on it. So it's great to have a tool there so that when code is committed, issues are flagged, might even block that commit if there are issues with it. But developers would still know how to do full manual testing of their own work. I've got on screen my sort of typical example, picture of a dog with an alternative text of a cat. Machines don't pick up on that kind of thing. People do. So yeah, there is generally disappointment when people realize how little is automatable. But it's good to do. It's a good hygiene factor. It's not sufficient in itself. Also, in sort of an accessibility mature organization, ARIA isn't the last word in accessibility. The developers need to understand the principles. They need to know where to find accessible, kind of tried and tested components and patterns. But it's like pepper in cooking. A little bit goes quite a long way. So I'm hoping there's some questions coming up, but just to summarize, I'd really love there to be less gaps. So if we run training, I would love to be out of a job from a training point of view. It's a little bit disheartening to keep repeating the same thing for 10 to 15 years. We do try and spice it up. Technology has changed a bit, but the principles haven't changed that much, and should all be sort of built in before they get to us, really. But in the meantime, training and documentation needs to be available to everyone who's working on interfaces, because it hasn't been there before. Requirements for people with disabilities should be included by default. Design annotations should be included by default. And acceptance criteria should include customized accessibility requirements. If you can, be using systematic design with a design system and components makes the whole process much easier. And you would have automated and manual testing incorporated little and often into your process. So that's that's the gaps. And Henry, I'm going to hand over to you in terms of questions because I haven't had a chance to look at them yet.
Awesome. Thanks, Alastair. No, that's brilliant. So much useful information there. We do have some questions. If anyone does have any more questions, please do submit them using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. And I'll try and get through as many as I can. First of all, Alastair, I mean, you spoke a lot about kind of organizations' maturity from an accessibility point of view. Kind of over your kind of 15 years of running this, do you think generally organizations now are more mature and more aware of accessibility, or is it kind of very much the same?
It's hard to say. I'll say, I can explain that in a second. I think there are more organizations who are more mature from an accessibility point of view now than there were 15 years ago, definitely. It's hard to say from just doing the training because there's a selection bias there. People come to us for training tend not to be accessibility mature. This is kind of their first step on it. So I struggle to answer that question slightly, but just from looking around, ING, for example, whose talk is coming up, I know they've been working on accessibility for many years. But unless you are talking about, in large organizations, unless you're talking about years worth of progression in accessibility, they're probably not mature. Because it does take that sort of ongoing effort. Not that it's necessarily a lot of effort within product teams, but organizationally, if you've got 10 product teams, you're going to need a couple of people who are looking after the accessibility side of things.
Absolutely, yeah. Cool. So we've got lots of questions have now dropped in. I'll start working through them. So we have a question here on screen responsiveness. Is screen responsiveness, in brackets, portrait or landscape, now done with a CSS command, or are developers compelled to create numerous screen heights or widths in HTML?
So, as I said, most sites are responsive these days, and the mechanisms for doing that using media queries, and they're quite flexible. You don't have to create lots of different sort of versions of things. You'll have a few breakpoints and things can be flexible within that. And that's not usually the problem I come across. So the problem I come across is that bit is all done because, and it's not from an accessibility point of view, or it's not an accessibility motivation necessarily, it's more that people want it to work across different devices, different screen sizes. But the same mechanism that makes it work on small screens is what makes it work when you zoom in on a big screen. So my main point there was that where people have used width-based media queries, they also need to think about vertical media queries, so that if you've got a sticky thing that is going to block most of your view when you're zoomed in, you can unstick it. So it's all controllable. That's not the issue. The issue is people don't think about the landscape version.
Brilliant, thank you. So our next question from Giada says, hi Alastair, great point on factoring in accessibility at the design stage. We're a local authority, Haringey Council, and are thinking of putting together a bespoke accessibility checklist that third-party providers can complete before we buy their products. For example, apps or microsites, so we don't have to face the ugliness of a non-accessible product when it's too late, i.e. after purchase. Are there any good checklists or templates you could recommend, please? And also any good training you could recommend, especially for app testing on both Android and iOS?
Well, that's 3 different things I can tackle there. So there are some good checklists. I will look that up, and if you make a note of my kind of Twitter handle, I'll post a link out to that a bit later. In terms of procurement, so procurement, particularly for local authorities, is a big issue, and it's It's really difficult, actually. I've worked with procurement people at national sort of public sector places, and it's yeah. If you've got somebody who can test accessibility, great. They can be part of that process, but it can be a huge amount of work. What I generally recommend from a procurement point of view is asking questions about their accessibility process. So all that stuff that I was going through at the end there about, do they include accessibility annotations? Do they have, a systematic way of designing things? Do they are there people trained in accessibility? You can ask those questions about their process, and that's going to give you a much better idea than just looking at the output. Because even if their output is quite good on day one, team personnel change, it could go downhill at a later point. So you really want to drill in at the procurement level on their process, and they need to have good answers. If they just answer something like, oh yeah, we're WCAG Act 2.1 compliant, that's not a good answer, because it means they really don't understand how much of an ongoing process this is. Also, we work with Harrogate. We've got some contacts there, so I think we can probably provide some more help through our contacts there. So we'll be in touch later.
Awesome, thanks, Alastair. So next question from James. James asks, are there any appropriate frameworks for retrospective accessibility design versus accessibility design built into the project from the get-go?
I'm not really sure what they mean by appropriate frameworks. Access for retrospective access. I'm guessing James means something along the lines of, what's the difference in effort between doing it afterwards compared to building it in as you go along? I had to answer a question like that for some government research a while ago, and my basic answer was, how much does it cost to replace the front end or to completely redo the front end? So the answer to that is your upper boundary for doing it later. Whereas when you build it in, if you're making decisions as you go along, and it can be as simple as, if you're a developer, like, I need a carousel component, I'm going to Google for a React carousel component. You could Google for an accessible React carousel component, and you've got a better chance of making sort of an accessible thing to start with zero extra effort, apart from just knowing to incorporate it from the start. There'll be a sort of 1-2% effort in terms of adding some attributes as you go along. The big effort is learning about it in the first place. That's the big sort of steep bit. After that, it's pretty it's a pretty shallow from an effort point of view. So I think I've answered the question, but feel free to add it in if you can reframe it and rephrase it so that I understand better.
Awesome, thank you. So we have a question here from Poppy, who asks, do you have any advice on how to recruit users with accessibility needs for research?
Yes. So there are some agencies who will help, like people for research. But if you're doing this ongoing, what I would recommend is getting to know some, maybe some of your local kind of charities, like, in Bristol, we've got an RNIB centre that's basically a training centre. So any kind of local charities can be quite good contacts, particularly if you're offering to pay for the user research. So you're giving their customers money essentially for a bit of their time, assuming it's a paid gig. And quite often people are people with disabilities, because they're hitting barriers, on their phones, on websites, they're quite enthusiastic about making it better. So as long as that's your motivation and you're coming with that kind of as a benefit of their effort, then that's usually quite a good mechanism. And using word of mouth, I think the Norman Nielsen Group literally just published a similar article on that quite recently. So if you want a bit more detail, I'd go and have a look at that.
Thank you. Excuse me. So our next question from Kaylee asks, we struggle with the recruitment of accessibility aware and skilled digital/tech staff. How do you recommend my organisation addressing this skill and knowledge gap?
Well, you kind of picked on the whole thesis that I started with, which is that it's not part of the default routes in for people. So it's a real struggle. I think there's, we struggle to recruit sort of accessibility experts because there aren't very many around. We have to create them. Essentially, we get quite a lot of sort of junior people or university graduates and train them up. So the answer, I'm afraid, is training.
Thank you. Got a question here from Rob. Rob says, such a great talk. Thank you, Alastair. What's the most effective argument you found to get accessibility buy-in from senior management? Is it legislative, financial, moral, all of them, something else?
Yeah, I've got I've got a presentation I did a while back with a slide that has several buttons and the person's about to press it, and basically you have to pick your button. You've sort of covered those. I mean, the arguments I tend to find work best at the practitioner level, people creating things, is the professional and sort of robustness principle. You're making a more robust product. It depends on your organization. If it's public sector, I probably would go with the public sector regulations, mostly because they're very clear, Meet Work Act 2.1. You've got to do that. And you've got to publish a page on your website saying whether you've done it or not. So it's quite public. If you're a commercial business, it does depend on what you do, but it is likely to be sort of a bit more financially based. I think there's another question from Matt on starting with SEO as a sort of good thing. And that works for some places. There's quite a few things these days which are mostly behind a login, so SEO is not necessarily very useful from their point of view. So yeah, you have to pick your button. It can be SEO, it can be financial in terms of increased audience, and it can be it's carrot and stick, and the stick being the legal side of things, which again can also turn into the financial. One thing I would mention, if you're talking legals, the worst case is you get sued, it becomes public and costs you lots of money. That's actually very unlikely, but what has happened repeatedly is that an organization will get a complaint and then they have to kind of put their day-to-day work aside and work on accessibility. So my argument often is, let's work on accessibility at our pace, and build it in so that we're not having to put our day-to-day work aside, and we do it on our timelines rather than timelines handed down from a judge.
Thank you. So we have a question here from Terry, who asks, hi Alastair, how would you encourage clients not to purchase accessibility overlays and actually invest in accessibility from early on, or invest in improving existing websites? I feel that attitude is often buying the overlay will solve all their issues.
Oh, there's a couple of ways you can approach this. So I think my sort of most technically accurate way of doing it probably won't help, but it's useful to understand. An overlay can't, so if you apply an overlay and it is relying on automation to improve the interface, anything it can do could also be done by technology at the user's end. If it's all automatic. If it's not automatic and you're having to alter things so that the overlay can better interpret alt text or better structure the page or improve things, those are things you should do anyway so that the user's technology can do that. So an overlay is an abstraction layer that you're adding on top that is just as likely to get in the way as it is to improve things. I would also look at the overlay fact sheet, as in FACT, fact sheet, which will provide lots of arguments and real instances where they've not helped, their marketing is misleading, I think would be a polite way of saying it.
Awesome. So we've got time for probably a couple more questions, I think. We've got a question here. Hi, Alastair. Are there any courses that you would recommend content designers, that you would recommend to content designers who are looking to improve their knowledge on accessibility? We've got a pretty good idea, but would like to improve further.
Well, I should probably say we provide that kind of training. If you want to get in touch, we tend to customize the training for the audience, because we sometimes split it into content design, sort of visual UX design, developers, testers. It's all very customizable. I don't know of any sort of more generic courses offhand, but I'm sure they are around. I just don't tend to look them up because we provide them.
Awesome, thank you. So next question from Abby, who asks, how can we push and advocate for accessibility in product-based companies, which is used by a diverse crowd where GDS standards are not followed, like in the public sector, where accessibility is considered a key?
Well, I talked about picking your button above in terms of financial, legal, moral, sort of right thing to do kind of stuff. There's also maybe when this is, I think these are being published on Thursday evening, Friday, have a look back through, and things like having a systematic kind of approach to design is half the battle, because if your product is kind of organic and every single component is different, that makes the whole problem much more difficult to solve. So if you can work on making things more systematic and updatable, reducing technical debt, things like that, it makes the whole process a lot more effective, a lot easier to do. So maybe start kind of laying the foundations as you're working on the sort of buy-in factor of working on accessibility, because it's always treated as sort of a cost benefit. So the more you can bring the cost down, the more benefit you can get on the other sort of side of the equation, the better. So just it's different for different organizations, so it's very hard to give a generic answer to that.
Awesome, thank you, Alastair. So I think that's pretty much all we've got time for today. I know that there are quite a few questions still there, but I'm sure Alastair, you wouldn't mind if people wanted to reach out to you directly on Twitter. I'm sure between yourself and the No Mensa Twitter account, we can answer all of those questions. So yeah, we are going to be back in around 2 hours time, at 1 p.m. UK time, for Bianca Prins of ING Bank, with her talk, Let Us Embrace the EAA. Yeah, Alastair, I'd like to just thank you once again. That was a fantastic session. And yeah, thank you to everyone that tuned in. We will hopefully see you back here in a couple of hours for Bianca's talk. Thank you.
Thanks, bye.